It is time. We will now have a panel discussion on the subject of the invertebrate mind, which I think will already produce some comments. The plan basically is this. I am the immoderator, okay? My job is to get them fighting amongst themselves for a while, and then when they're exhausted, you guys chime in and finish the feeding frenzy. Is that pretty clear? All right. So what I'd like to do is ask each of them to introduce themselves and give a short summary of what they talked of, or in case of one person, what they will talk about, so that you have basically meat, or if you prefer food generally, to guide the attack, all right? So let us begin that way. And basically, I'm supposed to be a facilitator of the yelling and screaming. Okay, so if there's, that's why I'm the immoderator, okay? Proceed.
Well, I'm Jennifer Mather, and I'm supposed to be a specialist in the cephalopod mind. I want to point out to everybody in this room, especially the person who thought of the title of this panel, that there are approximately 30 phyla of invertebrates, and that anybody who thinks that we can be in any way representative of all the invertebrates, and anybody who thinks that all the invertebrates are alike and they're just different and inferior to the vertebrates, that would be a way to get a discussion going. I think I've mostly worked with octopuses, and actually I am going to talk about squid tomorrow. I think that cephalopods have a mind. I'm quite sure it's not what we would define as the human mind, but I think it's a central processor that receives information, catalogs, stores it, makes decisions, and acts on that information in the future. And that being my definition, I'll pass it on.
My name's Adam Schreiber. I'm at the Uehiro Center for Practical Ethics at Oxford University, and also the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities. My presentation was about whether we can use lesion studies to assess whether cerebral cortical areas are necessary for the experience of pain. My argument was that cerebral cortical areas are not necessary for the experience of pain, or specifically the affective dimension or the unpleasantness of pain, but that they might give us some interesting things to look at in trying to assess what we should be looking for in other species. And for the purposes of this panel, I will also just say that I think there are sort of good reasons for distinguishing nociception from pain, and also for focusing on sort of valenced experiences as the sort of morally relevant things that we should be paying attention to.
Hi, I'm Lars Chittka. I work on honeybees and sometimes other insects, bumblebees, sometimes flies. But so my views on whether these animals have a mind are still somewhat mixed. Had you asked me 10 years ago about consciousness in bees and sentience, I would have said, oh, shit. Now I'm not so sure. I think there is mixed evidence. I think there's certainly good evidence that whatever is in an insect mind is very different from what's in human minds and so on, and that there are multiple ingredients to a mind and that they could be very different. So there might be some things that we share with insects. There might be other aspects of a mind that are wholly unshared. So mixed views on this topic, but we can discuss it more if you'd like.
Hi, I'm Reuven Dukas. I've been studying for quite a while now evolutionary biology of animal cognition, mostly in simple model systems, variety of insects, also blue jays. Blue jays are birds, by the way. North American bird, very similar to European jays for the Europeans here. And today I talked about insect emotion, but in general, I studied for a long time issues such as attention, learning, and memory. We work a lot on social behavior and aggression nowadays.
Hi, my name is Fernanda Pair. I was a discussant for the session on lesion studies and pain, and I guess I've studied I currently study neuroscience, cognition in humans, and before I came from a medical background, so my approach has mostly been human-based. I'm very interested in invertebrates, especially in cephalopods, and my approach would be to question how much we can apply the knowledge we have on the human brain and human brain function to other animals, particularly to invertebrates that do not share a system and central nervous system evolutively with us.
Okay, so I think the first step would be for you guys to ask questions of each other, since you've heard each other's talks and are in a position to make positive, negative, or critical remarks. So if you have any specific comments with respect to each other, they can start. I have one or two questions for one or two people, but let's see what develops autonomously first. Proceed.
So I have a question for my neighbor on the left. So I agree with the need to distinguish nociception from pain. I also was intrigued by your highlighting the problem that in some cases we can't afford to err just on the cautious side. We actually have to make decisions. How do we make them? So you raise the problem, do we invest the $1,000 for chickens or fish or cows? Go on, Min.
So
On what basis?
right. So I think the sort of argument that's been, people in here probably know that a lot of animal protection agencies and have historically been drawn to, what's the term? Charismatic megafauna, right? So like nice, cute looking organisms that resemble humans and, sort of like nicely sort of capture, trigger all of our empathetic responses. And then there's been sort of a movement lately to sort of reject that kind of framework, at least among certain circles. And if you sort of just look at the numbers, there's a very strong numbers argument that kind of pushes in the direction away from mammals. So, for example, like the number of chickens that are consumed every year compared to the number of cows is just astronomically higher. And then with fish, it's even more than chickens. And especially when you consider the sort of methods used for killing fish that involve a lot of other fish dying in the process. So I wish I had a sort of good answer to that. I do think it's worth sort of thinking about whether there are unique aspects of mammalian suffering that might sort of gravitate against these sort of pure numbers-based arguments. But I think in the absence of sort of further evidence, just the sheer strength of numbers is pretty persuasive. I don't know if that answers your question, but
well, I suspect the real question that you want to ask is, can we measure suffering in, say, battery chickens compared to industrialized type cow farming or something like that?
Yeah.
And then where is there a need to change more? So you would actually have to measure suffering in some way. And that's where it gets difficult.
Yeah.
Knowing the many subjective elements of pain and suffering and so on.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, you might, depending on what you think, you might think even if you had sort of perfect knowledge of everything that's going on neurologically, you might not know exactly how to do interspecies comparisons of subjective feelings, right? I mean, it's just sort of it kind of comes up against a very tricky question about how we measure sentience. I know that's not a very
I think I would
helpful
argue
answer.
that we should think about the gulf between what we actually do now and what would be humane treatment. Because, I mean, in the case of fish, in the ocean, they simply drag them all in nets, throw them on the deck of the boat, and leave them to die. And if you think about it, it's probably the same kind of thing as it would be if you died of drowning. And that's what fishers do.
It takes longer than the fish, though.
Sounds like a good argument to not eat fish to me. I don't know if Stephen would agree with that.
Consider yourselves moderated. No.
Oh, can I have a question?
Sure.
So I had a promissory note at the end of my last panel about asking this. So I was just really curious about this pain asymbolia patient. You said you worked with this person. And so do you think that there's a sort of, the way you described it, it seemed like maybe there was more going on than just a sort of lack of pain affect. Like they were actually just sort of blissfully happy, or like, so I don't know. I'm just curious if you could sort of say more about what's going on in this case where the person said that they felt pain, but it wasn't bothering them. Do you think it's just a pain disorder or some weird complicated thing going on?
So you're right. This person started, her initial symptoms were mainly manic symptoms. So mania could also help to hide some pain symptoms in humans, right? Because you're feeling euphoric and you're paying less attention to bodily sensations, as it has been described in some psychiatry textbooks. The interesting thing of this case is that the manic symptoms came down. I had to say it very quickly because I had 5 minutes and I used like 8. But in reality, what happened was she developed with these manic symptoms and these kind of expressions of joyful pain, if such a thing exists. Like there's something that bothers me, my head's bursting in two, but this is so funny. But then when manic symptoms came down, the asymbolia for pain persisted. And she only had damage in the right insula. So it was not bilateral. It was mainly, and it makes sense that she had, that the insular cortex is also relevant for some, it's part of the limbic system. So it's related to emotion expression and emotion regulation. So this burst of mania was kind of the beginning symptoms of the insular dysfunction. Then the manic symptoms came down and the asymbolia for pain persisted.
Thanks, Fernanda.
Just as a reminder, we're supposed to be talking about the invertebrate mind, but there are people who would say, since there isn't one, you might as well talk about vertebrate. No. I have a question, a point for Lars. I remember years ago, I went with Donald Griffin, who was studying bees at the time, onto a salt marsh on Cape Cod, and he pointed out that in most of the, at least commercial beehives, it's very dark. And the bees can't, in fact, actually pretty much watch each other doing the dance language. They have to feel it. And at least in some honeybees, the dancing bee is buzzing and the other bees are buzzing. And in the absence of the buzzing, some of the communication may not work at all. He even said there was some evidence if you put a bee in that didn't buzz, the other bees would sting it to death.
Yes and no. So the natural biology of the Western honeybee is to nest in cavities. They nest in hollow trees with ideally relatively small openings because that makes things easier for climate control and so on. So beekeepers essentially mimic that scenario. And the natural biology of the interaction during the dance is for it to be entirely tactile. It's never about watching. So they don't have to watch each other in order to read the dance. What they do is they have to follow each other. Essentially, one bee puts its antenna on the bum of the dancing bee and follows it around through the circuit. That's how the interaction takes place, and multiple bees can follow at the same time in that way. That's the cavity nesting bees. There's another Asian species, Apis cerana, that's also kept for beekeeping purposes, that also is naturally cavity nesting. There are also several species that nest on open combs that are attached under overhanging cliffs or tree branches and so on. In those cases, human observers can watch dances, but the bees still have to follow each other around, so they still don't use vision. But you're also right that there are other modalities involved. So There are brief buzzes that are not heard for very long distances by bees. They don't hear very well, but they're substrate vibrations, so they vibrate the coon while they're dancing. That's important. They also release pheromones that attract other bees to the location of the dance. So it's a multimodal thing to attract other bees to the existence of that information transfer. But once it takes place, the uninformed individuals need to follow, no matter if it takes place in the open nesting bees or in darkness nesting bees. It's a tactile interaction that needs to take place for the information transfer to occur.
More, the Asian version of the bees, is this still there? The Asian version of the bees, are these the bees that have defensive reactions to the giant yak killer wasps that are found in East Asia? These are wasps that are about 3 inches long that attack by biting people, and the bite saliva is a pheromone that brings other giant wasps, and then they start to sting. And of course, in Tokyo, for example, which is a city about the size of the world, they kill 30 or 40 people a year. Because they're so big. They're called yak killers by the Chinese. And the bee reaction is apparently that the worker bees will wrap the killer bee, the wasps, in worker bees, and then beat their wings and cook the killer wasp, because it can tolerate less heat than the workers, which seems to me to be some kind of organized recognition of a specific kind of enemy, which does speak to the question of what these animals are thinking they're doing, so to speak.
Yes, that's correct. So, or partially. So indeed, some Asian honeybees have a hardwired, it seems, defensive response to these hornets. So unlike many people think of invertebrates in general as cold-blooded, bees and some other social insects are quite warm-blooded. Honeybees, in fact, maintain a relatively constant temperature in their hives. But they can also warm themselves up from relatively cold temperatures. And for this particular scenario, it's useful that they can actually warm themselves up to higher temperatures than the hornets can tolerate. And because the hornet's cuticula is very thick, they can't easily sting. The honeybees can't easily sting these hornets, but they can overcook them, basically. It's a slow and not particularly efficient method, but it works to some extent. There are now, of course, some of these Asian hornets, not the giant ones, but actually a species that's smaller than the European hornet in Europe and spreading rapidly. And they munch honeybees in really great numbers. And it's not so much that honeybees are entirely Western honeybees are entirely defenseless against them. It's just that the defense involves them almost entirely down-regulating their foraging behavior, which means that the colony suffers losses in terms of nectar and pollen intakes. So it seems to me, at least, that these defense mechanisms don't necessarily, they do show quite a bit of an impressive behavioral repertoire in dealing with a variety of threats, but they don't necessarily, I think, to me at least, suggest an intelligent, an anti-predator defense that's mediated by insight or thinking of possible ways of doing away with these predators.
May I ask a question? So I have a question to mostly Adam, but it's relevant to everybody. My philosophy, when we talk about ethics, I can ignore the unresolved issues about pain, suffering, whatever, consciousness, sentience. I think that it makes sense for us to treat all animals as nicely as possible, and we've resolved all the problems. And then, of course, it becomes an issue of politics and decision-making. But I see no need for trying to draw a line what animals we are allowed to abuse and what animals we are not allowed to abuse. I find it artificial and unnecessary.
So I think I brought up some examples in my talk of cases where I think that that type of reasoning doesn't apply. I mean, I'm vegan, so I agree we should be as nice as animals as possible, and so people should be vegan if they can. So that's good. If everyone has already taken that step, but I also think there are cases where you can't sort of make those types of decisions. And just to sort of mix things up, I'll give an example from humans, because I think, again, I don't think this problem is only a question of which animals. So if you look at really young preterm infants that are born at, say, 25 weeks after gestation, there are interesting questions about whether they feel pain or not. They show a sort of grimace response in reaction to noxious stimulation, but they also show the same response to just touch. Now you might say, oh, well, we should just assume that they feel pain and be nice and respond accordingly. But the problem is if you sort of give analgesics every time they're at risk of a sort of retina disconnecting when they're born really young. So they have this invasive procedure done multiple times per day where doctor is holding their eye open. And if you're giving analgesics every time that you're doing that, you're going to be sort of putting them at risk, because analgesics are also not sort of consequence-free interventions. So I don't think there's really a way of avoiding this question of, saying, oh, well, we should just treat everyone as nice as possible, or just assume that everything's pain that might resemble pain, because they're always going to come across these hard cases where you're weighing costs against benefits, harms against benefits, and the way that equation works out is going to depend on how much you think or how likely you think it is that someone is actually in pain or not.
Well, I think I agree with the general idea that we should treat animals as well as possible, but we must have the knowledge of what it means. So, for instance, my octopuses are solitary, and every so often I have a well-meaning committee person who says, oh, well, what kind of social experience are you giving them? Are you kidding? If I put two of them together, I'll end up with one well-fed octopus. Just not quite the idea. I don't know to what extent I don't think we need to wait to act until we know. I think that would be a very bad idea. But on the other hand, I think we have to act with care. And I'd be happy to have somebody else talk about that. We have to act with care until we know, and even after we know, what would be the proper environment for an invertebrate that we don't know much about. That's two invertebrate people over here.
So, I would say just leave them alone in nature. Seriously, yeah. So if you can choose, just leave them alone. So I would say ideally we would minimize capturing and holding animals in the lab. It should be done as little as possible. So you resolve the problem.
It's not automatically true that when you study them in the wild, you do no damage or generate no advantage. So if I'm studying the squid who are floating in the open ocean in a little group, I could be treated as a predator, but in fact they habituate quite quickly, but I could be also preventing predation because I'm there. And I think we can disrupt an ecosystem or disrupt a social group just by the process of being there. And NSERC's actually quite aware of this now.
Just to reply, let's say 2 centuries ago, naturalists killed animals in order to identify them as new species to science. So one can argue whether it was good or bad, but one can argue on the positive side that people had to know what species exist. Hopefully they minimize the killing. Now, when we do science, it does make sense to ask, do we do good or not? And one might decide at some point that the cost outweighs the benefit. And I think a lot about it. I work with fruit flies. I have no question that, and I showed data today, that they definitely perceive certain conditions as positive and certain conditions as negative. And then, other than instruct my students that they have to treat them as nicely as possible, sometimes we do need to do some things that I know they perceive as negative. I do think a lot about it and how to minimize it and whether it's worth it. At this point, I feel that it is worth it because I can contribute ultimately to reducing animal pain. But I do worry a lot about it, and I think a lot, and I talk about fruit flies, I worked on bees too, how to minimize the negative aspects while dealing with animals.
I think it's a very difficult situation to be an individual who is studying pain because by definition, you must inflict it in order to understand it. And I'm sure this is true for people as well as animals. How do you decide what to do?
When it comes to fruit flies, there are no guidelines. So basically, I develop them while we go. So for example, I think it was Adam. Yeah, Adam talked about the headless cockroaches today, correct? This was your picture. There are labs, there are neuroscience labs that do experiments with decapitated fruit flies. I do not allow it in my lab. There is logic for doing it, but it's just below my threshold. I just think that it is unacceptable. So at this point, nobody bans it, so it's up to your feelings about your animals. So there is no right or wrong. Now, in general, Adam, did you say you're vegan? So you are vegan, so it means that you indirectly exploit more. I have a vivid image of it, being in Southern California. You inadvertently increase your exploitation of poor immigrant Mexicans who are now being separated from their children because they're the one who basically, I don't know whether there are Americans here, I don't see Steve. Yeah, they're the ones that are responsible. So the fact is that these poor immigrant workers are working very hard at below minimum wage because they're illegal, so one is allowed to exploit them. Your cell phone has been produced by not slaves, but very close to it, somewhere in China, people who live under, if it's not suffering, it's very close to it. If it's not slavery, very close to it. So there are many ethical issues yeah, we are lucky. We have a wonderful life, but we do cause indirectly suffering to many individuals, including humans.
Okay, so I was responding to you saying we should be as nice as we can. And so I think that involves, even if we're not going to be perfect, we should still sort of take as many steps as are reasonable. And so in terms of the idea of exploiting farm workers, growing animals for food is a very inefficient process that basically, you're using more crops, corn and soybeans, to feed animals than you would be if you were just sort of eating a directly plant-based diet. So it doesn't seem like that's really an argument against veganism. But I think sort of just going back to your original question of why can't we just be sort of as nice as possible and treat the animals as nice as possible? I think you kind of undermine that yourself because the whole apparatus of animal research is based on the premise that we might be causing some harms to animals, but those harms are outweighed by the potential benefits that are being created. And if you don't know which species are in pain or how much they're in pain, how are you going to do that delicate balancing act? Now, it's true that in practice, when people say the harms outweigh the benefits, they're mostly just hand waving. But if we take that argument seriously, that that's what sort of justifies animal research, is that we think that the harms, and I don't mean to apply it across all animal research. I think we can look at individual cases. But if the argument is that the harms outweigh the benefits, then we need to think really closely about which harms are actually being created and how serious we think they are. And just saying we should all be as nice as possible and not be cruel doesn't really answer that question.
I just want to point out that the utilitarian view of human-animal interactions almost inevitably involves harm to the animals and benefit to humans. And it's really not a fair equation. Can I comment?
Yes, I can give you a personal example. Many people who see a fruit fly coming towards their beer or wine glass would attempt to kill it. Since I started to work on fruit flies, I do not do it because these are wonderful little animals that are very sophisticated and they're not harming me. And I just completely changed my attitude because I know them better. In general, we know that when we know somebody, whether it's another individual or another species, when we know it better, we treat it with much greater respect. So I think that animal behavior research has had enormously positive effect on how we treat other species.
Can I ask a question of Lars? Is that okay? So here's my question. I was really struck by the distinction, or the two different experiments. The one experiment that showed that bees that had been given, that had pain didn't sort of protect a certain side of the body where they had a limb amputated. But then on the other hand, you mentioned that there's this sort of natural opioid response in response to a bear coming, which sort of signals that they're releasing painkillers in order to go on the suicide mission. So one thing that came to mind is that opioids kind of have both peripheral and central effects. So they can both alter the activity in the peripheral nervous system, but then they can also sort of directly intervene on brain regions and sort of reduce the affective component or both components in that. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts about how you might sort of parse apart this idea that, showing that opioids or painkillers have an effect in a way that kind of shows that it's involving more sort of central regions, or I guess I don't really know enough about the sort of neuroanatomy of bees to know whether that distinction still makes as much sense. Like, would it be the sort of activity in the mushroom bodies that would kind of be relevant to thinking about a sort of painkillers having a central effect? I'm not sure does the question make sense?
It does, but the answer is we don't know. So these were two studies from the mid-90s on bees, on this endogenous opiate system in bees and its relation to the preparation for the stinging response. And if I remember right, they simply looked at brain homogenates in various states after they'd received an alarm signal and so on. So whether that effect is peripheral or central, I think remains to be studied. I think we weren't quite finished with the previous discussion. So I think us saying, well, we should all be kind of nice to animals, especially if we know them personally, is a bit dangerous, because I think it's at the same level as sitting down a few centuries back with a bunch of slave owners and said, well, do we really need changes in legislation? We could all just agree to treat our slaves really nicely. Well, we could, and maybe there was one slave owner that did, or two, but the point is that so I guess we could be the instigators of legal change when it comes to experimentation with invertebrates, with bees, flies, and so on. The truth is that we know pretty well that the vast majority of our colleagues chuck away flies by the million on an annual basis without in their vials. They just starve to death eventually. And at the same time as they're studying them as models for pain and for anxiety and so on, they completely deny that there might be any form of suffering. So I think if we wanted change on that front, we would have to do it, and we can do it. And so it is an important question that we need to ask ourselves if we want to implement some change there. And I think the argument that, well, you can't really be a human being without causing some damage around you. Yes, probably. I mean, if you're an animal, then you have to eat something. But that's neither here nor there, because there are lots of choices to be made along the way. And I think the arguments for veganism, vegetarianism are, if you just look around a bit for animal battery farming and Google a few YouTube videos, are pretty overwhelming, actually.
I think in some ways we should be starting with the insects, and I would argue that it is not necessarily about generating regulations, though I think that's important. It's about generating some idea in the minds of the general public that these are interesting, fascinating animals. They deserve respect for who and what they are. There's a researcher named Kellert who looks at people's opinions of animals, and it's very, very clear that invertebrates are somewhere off in the corner. Particularly insects seem to be not appealing to humans. I'm not quite sure what we do about that. As I said, I'm lucky because my cephalopods are protected, and in fact, my octopuses are charismatic megafauna, which I find quite interesting. But what do we do about the insects? The insects make up a huge proportion of the animals on the planet. What is it, 60%? So what do we do about making... Of the animal world.
Probably more.
Much more.
Yeah. So what do we do about making it clear that all these fascinating, diverse, beautiful animals need to be respected and cared about? Challenge.
Well, let me inject an issue which cuts across both this question of how we treat the animals and the question of whether they have minds. Two different, very far apart animals are blood parasites, mosquitoes and vampire bats. Vampire bats raise their young over a full year, and anyone who watches them for their behavior is instantly impressed by the degree to which it's primate-like or cat-like or dog-like. There's a lot of very sophisticated social nurturing going on. They transmit the disease of rabies and several other diseases in tropical America, and are responsible in Mexico alone for hundreds of thousands of cattle dying from a paralytic version of rabies, which is a tremendous ecological and economic problem in Mexico. In Central and South America, particularly the Amazon basin, whole small communities of Aboriginal people are regularly extirpated as a result of the appearance of rabies in these vampires. Now, on the other hand, we have mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are also blood parasites. Mosquitoes also transmit disease. In fact, they transmit disease with a precision and an efficiency which might even make them more interesting in whether they have minds or not. But the question is, the idea of destroying the vampire bat caves in certain areas has often come up, and there are regular plans to try to extirpate mosquitoes, at least by putting oil on the swamps and spraying insecticides around in areas where the mosquitoes are found. Here we have a situation with an animal which is as close as we can come to say, I'm pretty certain they have minds. And an animal which most people would think, I'm pretty certain they probably don't have a mind, but we don't know, all right? And there is a good example cutting across the ethical and moral questions with the presence or absence of a putative mind. And I'd like to hear what people think of that. Excellent. Okay, consider it opened up to your comments as well as theirs. Okay.
So I'll just quickly say something. My rule is, and I would be the first to admit that it's somewhat arbitrary, I would definitely not kill a bat who tries to suck blood out of me. But I do kill mosquitoes that are biting me for self-protection. Somewhat arbitrary, but that's what I do.
You wouldn't know the vampire bat was biting you because they are very good at sensing whether you're asleep, and then they'll do it.
Still, you got my point. Because it's a mammal, I wouldn't hurt it. Meaning, I can go back to its cave and try, or for example, my colleague Paul Four, they basically knew that a vampire bat was hiding in the room, and then what do? You wouldn't kill a bat, but you would kill a mosquito. Is it arbitrary? Yes, it is.
Well, you can legally kill a human in self-defense, which I think is somewhat relevant in this context.
Let's begin with the first person over on that side.
Great, thank you. Well, I believe that the refinement of research on animal cognition in order to reduce animal suffering is an important matter. The importance of this issue, however, pales in comparison to the immense suffering generated by the animal farming industry. So my question to this panel is then, should scientists strive to genetically modify farmed animals, as Mr. Schreiber and others proposed, in order to enhance their welfare? Was that not clear enough? I can repeat.
I can repeat the question. So the question is, should we use gene editing or genetic modification to improve welfare of animals that are currently raised for food? Is that right? And he's referencing the fact that I wrote an article where I argued affirmatively to that question.
So you get to answer it.
It's open to the panel. I'd like to hear everyone's take on it.
So in general, I mean, I think that industrial farming has a lot of problems with it. So animal welfare is one problem. It's also really bad for the environment. It also increases the risk of antibiotic resistance developing that can be spread to humans. It also, in North America, there's sort of a unhealthy amount of consumption of meat that's linked to, various health conditions. I'm not saying, you can't consume any meat and be healthy, but there's sort of an overconsumption. So in general, the best solution, I think, would be to sort of take a step that just sort of got rid of the whole practice altogether. But if I had to choose between a world in which we have this exactly the way it is now, or a world in which the way it was now, except animals were genetically modified to not suffer as much, I would choose the latter option.
I think that world already exists. So I think that there are already successful attempts to essentially grow animal protein in a dish without a mind attached to it. So in essence, that should be tissue that also doesn't suffer, which is good enough as far as I'm concerned. If you can grow the meat in a dish without a nervous system, then I think you've solved that problem already.
Just to add something, you don't need genetically modified. My wife and I basically proposed, we didn't do anything about it, but I have a proposal for artificially selecting for animals. There is natural genetic variation in pain and suffering. Artificially selecting for farm animals that suffer less. So you don't need to use any modern technology. Artificial selection that humans have used for thousands of years can be quite efficient. It's not been done because there was no economic incentive to doing it.
Great, thank you.
Okay, now over here.
Great question and great answers too. I'm just coming back on the sentence that was, but the question is for everybody. You all kind of said insects are marvelous and wonderful creatures, and we should get to protect them way, way more, and we should get the public to see them as absolute, incredible little tiny creature. Of course, many people in the large public will sneer and scoff at that, at sentences like this, like, well, yeah, insects. And that's a reality. So they will brush the problem with the back of their hands. And what are the legitimate, like, real ways that you would that you would think is probable to actually change the perception of people about this? Because it's a challenge. They don't see them as wonderful creature, and I don't think that just by saying to them, but yes, they are tiny adorable creature, they will actually change their way of seeing them. So what would be other ways? What probable and fundamental ways we could change their perception, get to, like, we could be like this I'm sorry for the F word, but we, like in salmons, there are sneaky efforts that just get to the main point but try to evade the main problem without fighting the big problem. They just get to the same result, but they use a tactic that is sneaky. What would be that tactic?
Okay.
That tactic for you?
I have a bit of an answer to that. I think that science hides from the general public. I think that because we don't want the general public to interfere with our work, we think it's okay if we don't tell them about it. I go to elementary school, so there's a good reason that I have a favorite elementary school that I go visit. I'm on the Animal Behavior Society's Children's Book Committee, and I go take books to third graders. It was wonderful fun, okay? And I have argued to my colleagues that I think every individual, and I'm just seeing this for animal behaviors, but I bet every individual scientist you do that, adopt an elementary school, become friends with the kids. Mm-hmm. Talk to them about the animals, talk about all animals, be there, be a real person that they can connect with. I think if we did this with elementary school children, we would make huge progress in their understanding of animals and their understanding of research and their understanding of us. I just don't know how to get people to do it.
Actually, I'm more optimistic. How many people here have watched BBC natural shows best known for David Attenborough? That's it. I highly recommend to the people who haven't raised their hand to do it. Lots of people watch lots of natural shows. The BBC, David Attenborough is very charismatic, but obviously it's an enormous number of super talented people running these shows. And I think that the BBC alone has made enormous difference. I don't know what proportion of the public it captures, and change is definitely slow. But there is, I would say, an increasing proportion of the public that is more aware of how fascinating and complex insects are. Just to give one more note, when the BBC, you probably know about it as well, when they started their insect series, they contacted scientists around the world, including myself, and initially the producer was thinking about old-fashioned instincts that motivate insect behavior, and he heard from me and others that this is old-fashioned. We know much more about how sophisticated insects are, how much they learn, etc. And this was reflected in the final outcome. So basically, by educating the producer, we already changed how the BBC presented insects, and since then, there are more people who are educated about insects, more programs, but the change is slow. And as I said, I don't know what proportion of the public it captures.
Yeah, so you would say education, that's what I hear, is the main way to actually change the problem. Okay, thank you.
Let's go over here.
Okay. So this is a two-parter. The first part is more of a comment on the first question that was brought up about how to efficiently spend $1,000. So the same kind of people in the EA movement that funded Dr. Schreiber's work, say from the Open Philanthropy Project, with the help of animal charity evaluators, would say that $1. Oh, well, actually, I'm going to get to the point. Aversion studies from battery cage chickens have shown to be most effective in that regard, because compared to their natural instincts, it's been kind of I don't want to say proven, but the difference between battery cages and so-called free range has been shown to have some sort of enriching experience, and from that sort of evidence, they've deduced that $1 goes as far as displacing. This is through campaigns, of course, campaigning for free-range eggs, displacing 150 hens to a non-battery cage facility for 1 year. So if that gives us a standard to go on according to farm animal welfare studies, hens are kind of a priority. What do you think on that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, so there's sort of interesting questions. I mean, I definitely think that battery cages are terrible conditions. Some people sort of argue that they have some advantages over traditional, or not traditional, I guess, free range housing, but that's kind of an aside. But I guess, so one thing I will say about the effective altruism movement, for people who don't know, is basically this movement that said, we should apply sort of rigorous analysis to evaluating what's the most cost-effective interventions. So it's kind of started out in the human health realm of, if you can spend $5 and buy 100 bed nets, you can potentially save a certain number of children from malaria, and so we should be donating to the most efficient charities. Now, that movement has sort of moved to effective altruism for animals. Both movements are actually based on some of the ideas of Peter Singer, but I have some concerns about how smoothly that move went, because when it comes to these arguments about spending $10 will save 100 chickens' lives, it's always based on sort of psychology research about behavioral change, which sort of ties into the previous question. And I just think the sort of number of variables that are involved in changing people's behavior are a lot more complicated than knowing, how many bed nets $100 can buy and how likely that is to sort of prevent X number of cases of malaria. So I worry a little bit about how precise those specific measurements are when it comes to saying that, showing 50 people a video are going to convince 20 of them, because I don't know, there's sort of a number of complications with these types of social psychology studies.
Actually, this money is campaigning, going straight to the farmers and convincing them to switch from battery cages to cage-free.
Oh, so you're paying farmers to?
Well, not paying. You're paying. I'm guessing workers to go campaign at these farms or something like that to convince them to go cage-free, whether through.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess my concern is just whenever you're sort of spending money on trying to convince people to do something differently than they had been doing, it's just a much more complicated question than looking at the number of vaccines it requires to save 20 people. I mean, maybe not more complicated in some ways, but it involves a different set of variables that I think we haven't figured out yet. Because if we knew how to effectively get people to change their behavior, that would be done much more effectively, I think, in a lot of domains. But anyways, I appreciate the question. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts.
Okay, with that, good. Is that okay?
Well, I mean, I had a second question, but I can go back.
Okay, well, go ahead. Ask the question, sure.
Okay, I don't mean to throw this back into the thresher, and I wasn't there at all the days, so I don't know if this was brought up, but last year at McGill, there was an animal ethics and environment conference, and wild animal suffering was brought up quite a lot, and I was wondering if that plays a role in any of your deliberations about whether or not keeping animals in captivity is kind of, I don't know, moral in a sense, that you get to protect them from the harms of natural life, unfortunately. And also, there have been, Peter Singer has been bringing this up lately also. And there's also this devil's advocate argument that says that meat eating displaces more wildlife, unfortunately, and thus prevents more insects and more wildlife to be brought into existence, into an existence of suffering. So is there a utilitarian argument to prevent wild animal suffering?
Does anybody have a comment?
Well, I think we're getting away from the invertebrate mind, but I teach a course called Human-Animal Interactions, and one of the things that I brought up in discussion in the class was trophy hunting. And the class pretty well all didn't like trophy hunting. There's no problem with that. But the situation presently in Africa is that areas that are being set aside as reserves for trophy hunting animals are being kept from being overwhelmed by agriculture, by urban development. And so that the benefit and the harm are going hand in hand. And in the end, after much discussion, we kind of said, well, we still don't like trophy hunting, but we see the benefits. So maybe. It's not an ideal world, but sometimes trade-offs like that are important. Does anybody else got some trade-offs they can talk about?
Well, then perhaps, thank you. Perhaps we can go to the next question over here. All right, unless someone has, no, next question over here. All right.
I mean, I guess I will say that, I mean, I think that point has been raised. Sometimes people use it as an objection to utilitarianism to say, oh, well, if you really care about suffering, shouldn't you be intervening in nature to prevent all this wild animal suffering? And so some people think that's so counterintuitive that you should reject utilitarianism. But as you're pointing out, there are some people who are mostly utilitarian who sort of bite the bullet on that and say, oh, maybe we should be intervening in nature to prevent these things from happening. So I think it's an interesting question.
Thank you. Two questions, concise questions. I think, Lars, you mentioned about the honeybees getting ready to release opiates in case of, well, getting ready to commit altruistic suicide. Do those honeybees are aware of their imminent death? That's my first question. Do they anticipate their death? And to Adam, do you consider ethical to replace a dog with a rat in an experiment, given that they're both mammals?
This is probably the 15th time today that I have to answer a question with, I don't know. So awareness, we've already discovered, I think, is notoriously difficult to measure. So certainly the authors of those studies haven't explored that. And I don't think that it's necessary for that particular upregulation of a chemical that floods the body to prepare the bee to do something, that awareness is necessary for that to work. But I don't know. There's certainly the possibility that there is a perception of an imminent threat, at least, that there is a perception of a fear that needs to be overcome, but these things are very difficult to diagnose objectively.
So I just want to note that I actually really enjoyed Lars's presentation, and just want to say that I think his sort of clarity about which things you think you have good evidence for and which things you don't is very refreshing, and you know, it seems like you have a nice sense of as what counts as good evidence. So I hope you're not apologizing for saying I don't know. I think you are very nicely capturing which things are sort of supported at the moment. Okay, so the question of should we replace a dog with a rat?
Is it ethical to do so?
Is it ethical to do so? I think I think there's not a good justification for thinking that a rat's pain is any less important than a dog's pain. So I would say, in sort of direct terms, it would not be morally preferable to replace a dog with a rat. You might think that there are sort of good indirect arguments about the fact that people are drawn to dogs and cats, and that our relationships with dogs and cats sort of help us to sort of better develop more empathy towards non-human animals. And so you might have a sort of you might think there's sort of an incremental thing, like maybe we should really protect dogs first because that's a stepping stone to having more compassion for other species. But if you were just sort of looking at this pure equation of dog versus rat, I don't think you can say that the pain of one outweighs the pain of another.
However, there is a point. We now in research are enjoined to care about the 3 R's: refine, reduce, and replace. In many cases, it is suggested that we should be replacing sentient, cute mammals with non-sentient, useless invertebrates. And you can hear my hackles rise as I think about that. Insect people got a comment?
I was going to ask you earlier, Jennifer, when that question arose about what kind of tricks can we pull off in order to convince the public or policymakers. How did you cephalopod people do it? That thing that we insect people haven't managed. That is that cephalopods are now, at least in many countries, I think, under similar legal measures of protection that vertebrates are.
Yes. And they were.
How did that come about? Who instigated that and how was it done?
I mean, they have been legally protected in Canada for a long time, and that is a very, very interesting story because it was initiated by Gail Michener, who was in our biology department, and she came down to me down the hallway into the psychology department and said, "Jennifer, do you think of your animals as tissue?" And I said, "No, of course not." And she said, "Well, according to the American Department of Agriculture regulations, you can do anything to a non-vertebrate that you could do to dissected out tissue." How many of you are from the United States? It's still true. So she began this process. I'm not sure that Canada actually initiated the process in the European Union. The European Union there's more and more evidence, not so much that cephalopods are intelligent, I think, but that they're intelligent in a model that we understand. And so I think that parallel helped. And then Donald Broom initiated the idea when they were looking at the European Union regulations that indeed we should look at which animals were covered. And it was a long process. It took years. But with the European Union's actions, the spotlight was on how do we treat non-vertebrates? Do we have some idea that they're sentient? Do we have some idea they should be cared for? And so I think that very much got the ball rolling. And if someone else knows, go ahead.
I think we need to be realistic. I think that the majority of animals that are mistreated are ones that are used by us for food. So it means vertebrates, of course, such as cows, pigs, and chicken, and fish, and then decapods. And indeed, decapods are now protected in maybe 3 countries representing 0.001% of the world. So in Canada, you can follow the recipe for cooking a lobster. I hope I don't insult anybody. The typical cookbook recipe is basically taking a live lobster and putting it in hot water. So you can do it in 99.9% of the world. So the pragmatic approach is, yeah, I wouldn't fight for protecting insects, even though Norway protects honeybees. Okay. The only country in the world, but it represents 0.0001% of the world, 3 million people. And why? It's I believe, I don't know, but when I realized that Canada protected cephalopods way before any other country, I wanted to meet Jennifer and ask her, are you responsible for it? So many times it's just a human aspect. But cephalopods were easier because there is not a giant industry lobby who would say, forget about it. So the main issue is basically industry lobbying that would prevent from protecting the animals that are in most need of protection.
I think perhaps this is why there is so much problem with believing in the sentience of fishes and also of crustaceans, that we are looking at entrenched economic interest that is fighting back. Now, what we do about that, that's the next question.
So what I understood, Professor Lars, in your slides about consciousness and bees, you said bees display emotion-like states. What is emotion-like states? Because when we study emotion in human and some mammals, emotion has basically three aspects: behavioral, mental states, and physiological. Now you are compromising yourself with just behavior. And the other thing is, what's the difference between emotion and instincts, please?
Okay, the latter question I think is slightly easier to answer. So, an instinct I think is a behavior or set of behaviors that's largely hardwired and occurs with some predictability as a result of a particular environmental stimulus configuration.
It's similar to basic emotion, could be? Basic emotions?
I'm not sure. I think an emotion, conversely, is a transient state that affects a number of different behaviors, including perhaps instinctual ones. But I don't think the two map onto each other fully, or perhaps only insofar as that your palette of the spread of possible emotions that you or any other animal can have is to an extent hardwired. But I don't think they map onto each other really well. Sorry, I've by now forgotten your first question.
My first question was about
why do I call it emotion-like rather than an emotion? Well, all we can do is, so we measure more than behavior. We measure behavior across situations and context, but we also measure physiological states. Looking at dopamine and octopamine and so on and so on. And in those terms, I think the states that we're measuring are comparable to what's usually classified as emotional states in vertebrates, but of course we can't be sure. So we call them emotion-like states because they are, the bees in our case exhibit similar behavioral and hormonal or neurohormonal phenomena that we can measure, but whether these are actually emotions in the sense that we experience them, we don't know.
There's no, because it's exactly at the slide of consciousness, just that emotion-like, and if you are compromising your thesis with the experience of emotion, just that, because it was at that last slide, of consciousness. So if consciousness involves cognition, some memory, some emotion. So I understand that emotions involved are feelings. They are feeling that quality of sensation, I don't know how to say. But just because it was at this slide of consciousness and you talked about emotion, so I understood that you are affirming that bees have phenomenological experiences of emotions. It's not.
That's how it looks. I still prefer to be on the cautious side with crediting our animals with such states, but it looks that way. That's correct. But I think in formal terms, these things are still more difficult to answer than the more direct psychological experiments that we get from psychophysics when we answer what kind of colors an individual can discriminate and so on. We are on difficult territory here, and I think it's useful to acknowledge that.
Okay. Next question.
Hi. My question is for Professor Lars too. It was about the dance that the bees does to express where the flowers are. Does the bees have to learn it? Is it the same from a colony to another one, or is every colony has their own type of dance and that they have to learn while they grow up?
It's a very good question. So at a coarse-grained level, it seems that the behavior, the dance behavior, as well as the reading of the dance are innate, that they do not have to learn them. Nonetheless, there are subtle differences, for example, between different species of honeybees. So I'd mentioned earlier that there are a few, all other species other than the Western honeybee live in tropical Asia. Some are open nesting, some are cavity nesting. And there are subtle differences in their dialect, so to speak, especially with respect to the distance code by which the bees, through the duration of the waggle run, tell other bees how far the food is. And interestingly, there was a German-Chinese team that actually mixed two species of honeybees together in the same hive. And it turned out that under such conditions, the Asian honeybees could learn to correctly interpret the dance of the Western honeybees, which means clearly there is an element of learning and calibration. The researchers didn't investigate how that came about, but I can't imagine it in any other way that the dance following bees must initially have misread the direction, the distance information that they were given, and either overshot or undershot the target, realized, wait, there's nothing here. And then searched around until they'd found the correct location, and then basically reset the calibration saying, aha, so many seconds of waggle run means that distance. So even though the key ingredients are hardwired, there is a possibility of learning to do the fine tuning.
Thank you, that's really interesting.
I'm really pleased that there was a question I could answer with something other than, sorry, don't know.
Yes, my question is about something another speaker said a few days ago. He tried to present to us a new theory of origin of the mind, where he spoke of sentience as a type and the subjective sentience as tokens. What do you think about this idea? And if you think of it as a computational level, Mr. Hendricks also added the type as being the process to compare the top-down prediction made from a system with the bottom-up sensory information. What do you think about those very computational definition of what sentience would be and what subjective sentience would be?
Sorry, before you walk away, I was not here at that presentation, and I suspect several other people weren't either. So if you could just expand a little bit on the key message of that presentation.
Mr. Reber basically said that sentience was very old. It was a very old thing, like in almost cells had this. But depending on the species and evolution, the variation between the sentience between species was more like a token. So it was the same thing, the same type, but with lots of different tokens. And this type was defined by Mr. Hendricks as the bottom-down process that tried to predict what's going to happen in the world, meeting the bottom-up sensory system information, try to compare the two, seeing is that what is actually expected to happen? And this comparison process was spoken by Mr. Hendricks as the very essence of sentience. So did you agree that from a very sensory, computational point of view, those terms should be used to explain sentience and to explain the difference between our different subjective type of sentience? Did I explain that right? It was much better with him, I'm sure.
I wasn't here, so I don't know if I can comment specifically on his exact proposal, but I will say, I mean, so, philosophers kind of make a lot of hay about the relationship between the mind and physical objects. And there have been a lot of tough challenges about how you sort of connect those two things that have been debated for hundreds of years. And I will say I sort of understand the frustration with those types of debates, but I also think that sometimes scientists prefer to sort of define things in a way where they sort of say, information processing, we'll just use information processing as the thing that we care about, and then we can sort of avoid all of these tricky questions about how the mind relates to the body. But information processing doesn't really sort of answer the sort of fundamental questions that philosophers are asking. Maybe people think that those questions can't be answered, or that there's something wrong with the way that they're being asked. But I do think there's sort of a tendency to sort of think that, well, let's just focus on the things that we can understand, which is like how certain computations are performed. And the thought is we can sort of do away with these other questions. And I'm not convinced that we really can do away with those questions, even though I wish we could.
I wasn't here, so I'm not sure that I understand, but it seems to me that you were talking about what we call the reafference principle, the idea that you have a copy of what you do and that you compare that with the sensory information that comes in as a result. Well, I'm presently struggling with this problem in cephalopods because octopuses, and specifically octopuses, 3/5 of their neurons are out in their arms, okay? So there's a very, very great deal of lower level computation that must be going on in the arms. And actually, Frank Grasso considered this to be so overwhelming, he felt that there is a brain in the octopus brain, and there is a brain that is the compound of all the different information and processing and information transfer in the arms. I don't think he's right. It's a very interesting concept. But the fact is that when the octopus brain makes a decision about what to do, it doesn't send the commands to the arms and then generate a copy. I'm afraid I don't know what it does do. Does that help?
Thank you very much. I'll help a lot.
Let's go here.
My question goes to Professor Mather. I like what you said concerning how you think scientists should all adopt the school. I think that's a good idea. Actually, earlier on, Joshua Plotnick, someone who researches Asian elephants, showed us how he was basically applying that sort of principle, except in Asia. So it sounds like a good idea. Yeah, it would be nice if each elementary school could do that. Supposing there's one scientist per school. I'm not sure if you guys are, if there's enough of you, but maybe. But I can also think of counter arguments that people would bring up, and that would basically, it always has to do with how, like, kids have too much in their curriculum. It would be nice if we could teach them logic, philosophy, etc. But what would we remove? So what do you think about that? How did you manage to pull that off, basically? And how would you suggest this could be generalized, because I think maybe that's priority. That's a priority.
Well, I suspect it could be organized through the scientific societies, except I'm not sure that I could get the scientific societies to agree to do it. But the Animal Behavior Society has a lot of people from all over North, Central, and South America. And I'm sure if every one of us went to a school, I mean, I was lucky in the sense that I'm on the children's book committee. And what we do is we ask publishers in North America to send us copies of children's books that have something to do with animal behavior aimed at about a 3rd grade level. And so, for instance, this year, each one of the 4 members of the committee got 31 kids' books. And we chose the finalists. There were some that were too high grade level. There were some that were too low grade level. And it was hard to get them that actually talked about animal behavior. But after we had chosen finalists, and this is what ABS does, we wrote, and it wasn't us, it was central office, but anyway, they wrote to the publishers of the finalist books and said, please send 4 copies of each book to each of the members of the committee. Okay, and then when we got them, we trotted out to a school that we knew and found at least one, maybe a couple of 3rd grade classes, talked to the teachers, asked the teachers if they would support the children in evaluating these books. And the teachers, by the way, are absolutely delighted. Not this year, but last year, the teacher in the class that I went to simply changed the curriculum completely for a month, just based the curriculum on these books. And by the way, the thing that I like most about it is the children voted, and the winner was the children's choice. I'm just, as I said, I'm lucky I get to do this. I've said to several people that in terms of this thing called service that we're supposed to do as scientists, this is way, way too much fun. I think we could do an awful lot like that. I don't know how to persuade the scientific societies. Anybody got any ideas?
Yes, I do. Actually, it's been done. Both NSF, the major scientific funding agency in the US, or one of the major, and NSERC, which is the major funding agency in Canada, definitely expect scientists to be involved in what's called scientific outreach. In NSF, it's been going on for a long time. NSERC maybe a bit less. So basically, researchers in the US have known for a while that they have to include in their proposal scientific outreach, and they've been doing it. So change is happening, actually.
Okay, so even when there's no program for that, you'd say go straight to the teachers.
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
Well, I'm asking Mrs. Mather, but that's really interesting as well. But you'd say, supposing there's no program, for, like, for example, here, I think Professor Mather was saying that you have to do it on an individual basis. You'd say go straight to the teacher or go to the administration, or...
It's done a lot, actually. I can tell you personally, in my case, my wife, who used to work with me, has gone to both our children's school to talk about our research. So actually, a lot of it is done without some, say, scientific organization from above. It's very common for schools to ask parents to come to talk about their job, and scientists do it as well. So I think it's stuff that is ongoing.
That's a great initiative.
Okay, thank you. I remember we used to take a bat to 3rd grade public schools in Rhode Island until the state health department found out about it, and that stopped. Okay, next question. We have 8 or 10 more minutes now. I just want to be sure that we're going to give you two that, and then anyone else, if there's time left, yes, but make sure you understand both of you will get.
I have a comment to make. Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the problems of this, and I'm sure my fellow scientists will agree, is that we are evaluated for our research, our teaching, and our service. And these things that I have been talking about are service, and they are not valued in promotion, and they are not valued in salary, and not valued for us, and they should be. So there. Wait a minute. You're with NRC. What do you people do about it?
She shrugs her shoulders. Here, give the mic. Explain NRC.
I think we have the same issue at the National Research Council as well, and that's probably the same for any researcher, and that's unfortunate if it's the case, if it's the same thing. Unfortunately, I'm not from the research side of NRC, so I'm not 100% sure of what I'm saying, if it's right or not. But certainly people have been trying to do more outreach, and I think it would be encouraged. We just need to find, I guess, the will and the support from higher up to get it done.
I just want to add, I know the questions are quick. It'll be really quick. So I just want to say that I think what the people on this panel do is very admirable and sort of goes beyond the call of duty, and is certainly something scientists should aspire to, but it might also be worth, from the audience perspective, thinking about the fact that large-scale societal change might involve things other than just scientists being really good at doing outreach. It seems like there maybe should be a division of labor where scientists do certain types of research, but other groups might bear more of the social responsibility for certain aspects of doing things. And thanks.
Well, that's actually a really good point, because we're all in this. We're all in this alone, right?
So on the question of insect minds, how much do we know about, maybe this just give me the elevator pitch version, how much do we know about the preservation of connections and information learning through the process of pupation in animals that pupate?
Maybe I'll answer because I've worked on it. So people have talked about it for about a century. And in spite of a few papers that argue that there is no critical evidence, for example, for the persistence of memories from larvae to adults. During the pupal stage, there is such massive reorganization that it's unlikely to happen. You can find a few papers in the literature about it, but myself and my colleagues who examined the data critically don't think it happens.
So the neural reorganization is so complete, it just
theoretically it's possible, but as I said, there is no critical evidence for it. It's unlikely. Also, usually, if you know a bit natural history, larvae and adults have very different natural history. They're almost like different animals. And the adaptive significance of it would be maybe relatively small. You want to say something different?
I want to say something. Also do this. Tadpoles turn into frogs, and that's a metamorphosis which involves neural reorganization. But that has not been looked at in terms of what goes through.
So I think
Personality is the same across from larva to adult insect.
Sorry. So I think the evidence is mixed on the front of the ecological significance. There are plenty of insects, for example, that need to locate oviposition sites and also food resources that they themselves were raised on as larvae, and there's plenty of evidence that whatever they were fed on as larvae, they will return to later in life. So there is ecological meaning for any mechanism to implement that. But I agree with Reuven that the evidence that that works via memory is weak or non-existent, because a very simple way by which it can be implemented is, of course, that these chemosensory cues are on the or in the pupa itself, so that the adult, upon emergence, will actually have direct exposure to the chemicals that it's been exposed to as a larva. So you don't need memory in order to implement the well-known observation in many insect species that adults will return to resources that they've been raised on as larvae.
Let us quickly go to these two people that are remaining first, all right?
Okay, I'll try to make
And
it
then
quick.
we have more to say. But quick.
Okay, there's such a big emotional component to our behavior towards invertebrate. They're often associated with rotting, poison, disease, and death. Like fruit flies, ticks, and spiders rarely seem like good news. And ultimately, when we die, maggots will eat us. So I'm wondering, like, regardless if invertebrates are sentient or not, is our behavior towards invertebrates hardwired and makes our changing of minds almost impossible?
That's something that I think a lot about when I see my little boys. They definitely seem to enjoy to kill ants and other animals, and they obviously don't get it from their parents. And I wondered whether there is some instinctive human behavior to kill animals that intrude our neat environment. And of course, over evolutionary time, many of these animals were probably not good for us. On the other hand, I don't know whether they get it from other children. But in children, you definitely see this desire to basically eliminate movement of anything that moves that is small enough. If it's large, they would run away. If it's small, they try to kill it.
I do not think there is. Now, there are some very specific phobias that individuals have, and in that case, I think some of them are at least partly hardwired. I think that we have a tendency to like the things that are like us. So the vertebrate, the dog, the horse, they're similar and they make us feel comfortable. And the praying mantis and the ant, they're not similar. But that's a cognitive bias. That's not an instinct. I'm quite sure that if we were trained to respect other animals, that we would do so. That what you're asking?
Yeah. But I see often like if you take an apple with maggots on it, like there's a feeling of disgust that emerges naturally, it seems.
It's just differentness.
Let's go to her comment first.
Thank you very
before
much.
Because we have this is the last person.
Okay.
Speak quickly, they will speak quickly, and then
Okay,
there's
as
still more to
quickly
be
as I can.
done when the machine is off.
Okay, so throughout the summer school, we talked about sentience as it was brought up as an argument to end animal cruelty, animal suffering. So I was wondering if, according to you, the thing that protects us as human from being cruelly treated is our sentience. Do you think it's we're not killing each other, treating each other as we treat animals just because human beings are sentient? Do you think it's enough to protect us?
Didn't get the question.
What exactly is the point? The question, I didn't get it either.
Is the reason we have moral obligations to other humans because they're sentient? Is
Yes,
that the
because
question?
we always bring up sentience as an argument to end animal cruelty. So I was wondering if sentience is what is protecting us as humans.
I think 30 seconds. I think the quick answer among philosophical ethicists, they would say that sentience is one aspect of why we have moral obligations to other humans, but there might also be other things like autonomy or dignity that should also be cared about. But these are all issues that are under debate, and you could also ask these questions about whether other animals have those things as well. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
That depends on whether we get another 30 seconds.